Emma stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her small hands gripping the frame so tightly her knuckles turned white. And when her mother turned from the sink and saw the tears streaming down her daughter's face, she knew something had shattered in their world. "Mom, does Daddy love someone else now?" The words came out in a whisper that felt louder than a scream, and Sarah's hands went still in the soapy water, the plate she'd been washing slipping back beneath the suds as time seemed to stop. The question hung in the air between them like a fragile piece of glass, and Sarah felt her heart drop into her stomach, the weight of it pressing against her ribs, making it hard to breathe. She wanted to say no immediately, to dismiss it as childish imagination, but the look in her 10-year-old daughter's eyes told her this wasn't a random fear. This was something Emma had seen, something that had convinced her innocent heart that the foundation of their family was cracking. Sarah dried her hands slowly, buying herself seconds to compose her face, to keep the panic from showing, and she knelt down to Emma's level, tucking a strand of brown hair behind her daughter's ear with fingers that trembled only slightly. "What makes you ask that, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt, and Emma's lower lip quivered as she clutched the phone she'd been holding. It was Sarah's old phone, the one they'd given Emma to use for games and photos. And with shaking hands, the little girl turned the screen toward her mother. The image on the screen was grainy, taken from a distance, but clear enough to make Sarah's breath catch. It showed her husband, David, standing outside a building downtown, and next to him was a woman, younger than Sarah, with auburn hair and a bright smile, and David was laughing, actually laughing in a way Sarah hadn't seen in months, and their hands were touching. Emma had taken the photo that afternoon when Sarah had sent her to the corner store with her older brother, and she'd seen Daddy when she wasn't supposed to, seen him when he'd said he was working late at the office, seen him happy with someone who wasn't them. Sarah pulled Emma into her arms, holding her tight as her mind raced through the past 6 months, cataloging all the signs she'd tried to ignore. David coming home late, with vague explanations, the phone calls he'd taken in the other room, the distraction in his eyes, even when he was sitting right next to them at dinner, the way he'd stopped really seeing her when she spoke, as if his mind was always somewhere else, with someone else. That night, after Emma had cried herself to sleep in Sarah's arms and their son Jake had retreated to his room with headphones on, sensing the storm in the house, Sarah sat alone in the dark living room, the photo on the phone screen illuminating her face as she stared at it, searching for an explanation that would make this okay, that would prove her daughter wrong and restore the world to what it was supposed to be. She and David had been together for 15 years, married for 12, and she'd thought they were happy, not perfectly happy, not like the movies, but real-life happy, the kind built on mortgage payments and parent-teacher conferences and inside jokes that no one else understood. When had that changed? When had she become someone he needed to escape from instead of come home to? The front door opened at nearly 11, and David walked in with his jacket slung over his shoulder, his tie loosened, looking tired but also, and this was what hurt most, looking lighter somehow, as if whatever he'd been doing had lifted a weight that home only put back on his shoulders. "Hey," he said, stopping when he saw her sitting in the dark, and there was something in his voice, a guardedness that confirmed he had something to hide. "We need to talk," Sarah said, her voice quiet but firm, and she watched his face shift, watched the guilt flicker across his features before he could mask it. She showed him the photo, watched him pale in the lamplight. She switched on, and before he could speak, she told him about Emma's question, about their daughter's tears, about the trust that was breaking in their little girl's heart. David sat down heavily on the couch, his face in his hands, and for a long moment he was silent, and Sarah realized she was holding her breath, waiting for the confession that would end everything they'd built. "I'm sorry," he finally said, and the words hit her like stones, each one heavy with meaning, and her eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for Emma's sake. "I'm so sorry I made you both worry. Then I've been secretive and distant, but it's not. He paused, looking up at her with eyes that were earnest and afraid. It's not what you think, Sarah. I promise you, it's not what you think. He explained that the woman in the photo was named Grace, and she owned a dance studio downtown, and for the past 3 months he'd been taking lessons there twice a week. And the reason he was touching her hand was because she was teaching him the waltz. The explanation sounded absurd, almost insulting in its improbability. Their whole marriage was imploding because he wanted to learn ballroom dancing. But as David kept talking, as the words tumbled out of him in a rush of relief at finally being able to tell the truth, Sarah began to understand. He reminded her of a conversation they'd had years ago, before Emma was born, when they'd been at a wedding and watched the bride and groom glide across the floor in their first dance. And Sarah had said wistfully, "I wish we could dance like that. I wish we'd learned before our wedding." And David had laughed it off, because they'd both been terrible dancers. Had done an awkward sway at their reception that was more shuffling than dancing. But he'd never forgotten the longing in her voice, the small dream she'd expressed and dismissed. And when their 15th anniversary started approaching, he'd decided to do something about it. He'd found Grace's studio, signed up for private lessons, and had been practicing for months, suffering through sore feet and embarrassing mistakes, all so that on their anniversary next month, he could surprise Sarah by taking her dancing, really dancing, the way she'd once dreamed about. "I wanted to be good enough to sweep you off your feet," he said, and there were tears in his eyes now too. "I wanted to give you something beautiful, something that showed you I still think about those little things you say, that I still want to make your dreams come true. Even the small ones you forget you mentioned." The relief Sarah felt was overwhelming, a wave that crashed over her and left her breathless. But mixed with it was something more complicated, hurt that he hadn't just told her, frustration that his grand gesture had caused so much pain, and sadness that they'd reached a point where secrets felt necessary, even kind-intentioned ones. "You should have told me," she whispered. "Emma thinks you don't love us anymore, and her voice broke. "I was starting to believe it too." David moved closer, taking her hands in his, and she could see the regret written all over his face. "I know I've been distant," he admitted. "The lessons, the practice, the planning, it all took so much time and energy, and I thought keeping it secret would make it more special. But I didn't see what it was doing to you, to Emma. I didn't realize how it looked from the outside." They talked through the night, really talked in a way they hadn't in months, about more than just the dance lessons, about how the demands of his job and her part-time work and raising 2 kids had slowly pushed them into parallel lives instead of a shared one, about how easy it was to stop really seeing each other when you saw each other every day, about how love needed more than good intentions. It needed presence and communication and deliberate attention. In the morning, David sat down with Emma at the breakfast table, and Sarah watched from the doorway as he explained everything to their daughter, speaking to her not as a child to be placated, but as a person whose feelings mattered, whose trust he had broken and needed to earn back. "The lady you saw is Miss Grace, and she's teaching me to dance so I can take Mommy dancing for our anniversary," he said, showing Emma videos on his phone from the studio, clumsy footage of him counting steps and stumbling through turns, Grace laughing and repositioning his feet, everything innocent and awkward and sweet. "I should have told you and Mommy what I was doing, and I'm sorry I scared you, sweetheart. I love Mommy more than anything in this world, and I love you and your brother more than anything in this universe. No one else, no one ever, could take your places in my heart." Emma studied his face with the serious intensity that children have when they're deciding whether to forgive, and then she asked, "Can you show me the dancing?" And David laughed, embarrassed, but he stood up and did a few basic waltz steps right there in the kitchen, counting under his breath, and Emma giggled and said he looked like a penguin trying to ice skate, and just like that, the tension began to dissolve. Over the next few weeks, the family began to heal and rebuild, But with more intention than before, David cut back on his hours at work and was home for dinner every night. And Sarah started really asking about his day and listening to the answer instead of just waiting for her turn to talk about hers. They established a family game night every Friday, and though Jake complained it was corny, Sarah could see him smiling as they played charades and Monopoly and cards. David continued his dance lessons, but now everyone knew about them, and he'd come home and practice in the living room, and Emma would stand on his feet like she had when she was little, and he'd waltz her around while she shrieked with laughter. Sarah even went to the studio once to meet Grace, who turned out to be a kind woman in her 50s with a passion for teaching and absolutely no romantic interest in her married students. And she showed Sarah the routine David had been working on, and Sarah had to admit it was beautiful and touching, and exactly the kind of thoughtful gesture that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with him in the first place. Their anniversary arrived on a Saturday in June, and David had planned everything. He'd reserved a private room at a beautiful restaurant with hardwood floors and windows overlooking the city, and he'd arranged for Jake and Emma to stay with Sarah's sister for the night. When they arrived at the restaurant, Sarah was surprised to find soft music playing and candles lit, and David, wearing the suit he'd gotten married in and that still somehow fit, took her hand and led her to the center of the floor. "I'm not perfect at this," he said, his voice nervous and tender, "and I'm probably going to step on your feet. But I wanted you to know that I still remember everything you say, every dream you mention, every wish you make, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make them come true." The music swelled, and he placed one hand on her waist and took her hand in his other, and they began to move. And he was right, he wasn't perfect. His timing was sometimes off, and he had to count under his breath during the turns. But he was good enough to guide her around the floor in sweeping circles, good enough to make her feel like she was floating, and good enough to make her cry happy tears that streamed down her face as they danced. "When did you become such a romantic?" she asked, laughing through her tears, and he pulled her closer and whispered, "I've always been romantic. I'd just forgotten how to show it. But almost losing you, seeing the fear in Emma's eyes, it reminded me that love isn't just something you feel, it's something you do. Every single day." They danced through 3 songs, and then they had dinner, and they talked about their 15 years together, the good and the hard, the moments that had built them up and the ones that had worn them down, and they made promises to do better, to be more present, to never let silence and assumption fill the spaces where conversation should be. When they got home that night, they found that Emma had left a drawing on the kitchen table, a crayon picture of their family holding hands under a rainbow, and across the top in her careful handwriting were the words "Daddy loves us" and "We love Daddy," and Sarah pinned it to the refrigerator where it would remind them every day of what they'd almost lost and what they'd fought to keep. In the months that followed, the changes stuck not perfectly, because real life is messy and people are imperfect, but genuinely, and the family grew closer, more connected, more deliberate in their love for each other. David taught Sarah some of the dance steps he'd learned, and sometimes after the kids went to bed, they'd put on music and waltz around the living room in their socks, laughing when they bumped into furniture, holding each other close when they got it right. Emma's fear faded, replaced by the security of seeing her parents choose each other every day, not just in grand gestures, but in small ones. The way Daddy kissed Mommy goodbye every morning, the way Mommy saved Daddy the last cookie, the way they held hands on the couch during family movie night, and on Emma's 11th birthday, when she blew out her candles and Sarah asked what she'd wished for, Emma smiled and said, "Nothing. I already have everything I want." And Sarah and David exchanged a look over their daughter's head, a look that said, "We almost lost this. We almost let this slip away, but we didn't. We fought for it, and we'll keep fighting for it for the rest of our lives." The story of the misunderstanding became a family legend. something they'd laugh about years later. Remember when Emma thought Daddy was having an affair, but he was just learning to dance? But beneath the humor was a deeper truth. A lesson they'd learned together about the importance of communication, about how secrets, even well-intentioned ones, can cause harm, about how love requires not just feeling but action, not just commitment but presence, not just promises but daily choices to show up, to be honest, to stay connected, even when life gets busy and complicated. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, when the house was peaceful, and the kids were doing homework, and dinner was cooking on the stove, Sarah would think back to that night when Emma had asked her devastating question, and instead of feeling pain, she'd feel grateful, because that moment of fear had woken them all up, had forced them to look at what they were becoming and choose to be better. And in the end, the crisis had been a gift, a painful, necessary gift that had saved them from drifting apart, and had brought them back together, stronger and more intentional than before, a family not just by blood and law but by choice. Every single day, choosing each other, choosing love, choosing to stay,